In 1957, in the hushed, labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, Father Alistair Finch, a linguist of once-in-a-generation talent, vanished without a trace. He had been entrusted with a task of immense importance: the translation of a collection of Coptic texts so ancient and obscure they were considered little more than historical curiosities by all but a select few. The official story, disseminated with quiet efficiency, was that of a personal tragedy. Father Finch, they said, had suffered a profound crisis of faith, overwhelmed by the heretical whispers in the ancient manuscripts. He had abandoned his vows, his work, his life, and simply walked away, a soul lost to the wilderness of doubt. His research was sealed. His name was quietly struck from academic correspondence, and the world, with its ever-shortening memory, forgot him. His story became a cautionary tale whispered to young seminarians, a testament to the spiritual dangers lurking in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The truth, however, was not lost. It was buried, entombed under 60 years of institutional silence and deliberate misdirection. But in the long shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, secrets are not stones, they are seeds. Given enough time, they can find their way to the light. More than 6 decades later, a chance discovery in a forgotten storeroom, made by a woman with no connection to the original event, would unearth a single cryptic page. This fragile piece of paper, stained with age and fear, would become the catalyst, reigniting a mystery the Church believed was buried forever and challenging the very foundations of its carefully constructed history. It was a discovery that would prove that the past is never truly past, and that the most dangerous secrets are not those that are forgotten, but those that are actively hidden by men who wield power as a shield and silence as a weapon. The quiet dedication of one person would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a conspiracy of power, greed, and murder, proving that even within the most sacred walls, the pursuit of truth can be the most unforgiving of heresies. The world was about to learn what really happened to the forgotten Father Finch. Dr. Elena Rossi was a woman who lived in a world of quiet detail and patient restoration. As a senior conservator for the Vatican museums, her domain was not one of grand galleries, but of climate-controlled backrooms, where the delicate fabrics of history were coaxed back from the brink of decay. Her work was a slow, meditative dialogue with the past. She was currently assigned to a project deemed both mundane and overwhelming, cataloging and preserving the contents of a disused storage annex adjacent to the papal sacristy, a space that hadn't been properly inventoried since the Second World War. It was a tomb of forgotten vestments, tarnished chalices, and chests of ceremonial miscellanea. Dust, thick and gray as ancient ash, coated everything, a shroud over decades of neglect. For weeks, her life had been a cycle of meticulous brushing, chemical analysis, and data entry. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, the Roman sun casting long, hazy stripes through the grimy window panes, that she came upon a large, dark wood travel chest. It was unremarkable, bound in iron straps, its lock long since rusted shut. The manifest simply listed it as liturgical linens, Pius XII, circa 1950. With practiced ease, she and an assistant pried the lid open. Inside, as expected, were layers of yellowed lace albs and embroidered stoles, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. As she carefully lifted the final layer of linen, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. The floor of the chest was not smooth. A section of the wood felt different, a subtle incongruity that 99 people out of 100 would have missed. But Elena's entire profession was built on noticing the 100th detail. She ran her fingers over the area, feeling for a seam. There was a hairline crack tracing the outline of a false bottom. Her heart gave a slight, uncharacteristic flutter. Such discoveries were the stuff of fiction, not the dry, academic reality of her work. Using the fine point of a restoration tool, she carefully worked at the edge until, with a soft click, the panel loosened. She lifted it away. The secret compartment was shallow, no more than an inch deep. And inside, nestled in the dark, was not a jewel or a relic, but a single, folded sheet of brittle, cream-colored paper. It was a page torn from a journal, covered in a tight, frantic script and a complex series of ciphers. At the bottom, one line was written in plain, albeit shaky, Italian. They see only heresy, but the numbers tell the true story. V knows. God forgive me. The signature was unmistakable to anyone who had studied mid-century Vatican correspondences. An elegant, stylized AF Alistair Finch. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the storeroom. She had heard the stories, of course. The brilliant priest who broke. But this page felt different. It didn't speak of spiritual doubt. It spoke of numbers, of a secret, of a man named V. It felt like evidence. Elena knew she was holding something dangerous. Taking it to her superiors was the protocol, but an instinct, a deep-seated unease, told her it would simply be absorbed back into the silence it had just escaped. She thought of a man whose work she had followed for years, a secular historian who specialized in the Vatican's most intractable puzzles, a man unafraid to challenge official narratives. Dr. Julian Croft. He was a pariah to the Curia, but a hero to historical truth-seekers. That evening, in her small apartment overlooking a quiet Roman courtyard, Elena Rossi scanned the page. With trembling hands, she attached the file to a secure email, typed a brief, cautious message, and sent it out into the digital ether, addressed to a man she had never met. She had opened a door she could not close, and now the ghost of Alistair Finch was no longer hers alone. She had passed the torch, or perhaps the curse, to the one man in the world who might be willing to follow it into the dark. Dr. Julian Croft's London office was a controlled chaos of books, maps, and archival documents. It was less an office and more a testament to a life spent wrestling with the ghosts of history. At 45, Julian possessed a restless energy, a mind that was always connecting disparate points on the timeline. His specialty, the political and financial history of the modern Vatican, had earned him both acclaim in academic circles and a permanent position on the Church's unofficial blacklist. He viewed history not as a static record, but as a crime scene where the truth was the first victim. The case of Father Alistair Finch had been a pebble in his shoe for over a decade. It was too neat, too clean. Geniuses in linguistics, deeply devout men, didn't just evaporate because they read a difficult text. It felt like a story crafted for public consumption, a narrative designed to close a door. Julian had made inquiries over the years, filing official requests for Finch's research notes, only to be met with a wall of polite, unbreachable bureaucracy. The files were sealed, they said, out of respect for the priest's tragic spiritual collapse. Julian never bought it. He was at his desk, deciphering a 17th-century papal bull related to banking practices in Florence, when the email arrived. The subject line was simple: Alistair Finch. Most such emails were from amateur conspiracists or students. He almost deleted it. But the sender's name, Dr. Elena Rossi, Vatican Museums, gave him pause. He opened it. The message was terse, explaining the context of the discovery in a few short sentences. And then he saw the attachment. He clicked, and the scanned image of the journal page filled his screen. He leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. It was Finch's handwriting. He'd seen enough samples of his earlier public work to know it instantly. But this was different. The script was tight, pressured. It was the writing of a man composing his thoughts under immense strain. He saw the cipher, a maddeningly complex mix of letters, numbers, and what looked like modified Coptic symbols. Then his eyes fell on the plain text at the bottom. They see only heresy, but the numbers tell the true story. V knows. God forgive me. The numbers. That was the key. Not heresy. Numbers. And V. A cold, exhilarating certainty washed over Julian. This was it. This was the anomaly, the piece that didn't fit the official story. This was the loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire carefully woven tapestry of Finch's disappearance. He felt a surge of adrenaline that was more potent than caffeine. The ghosts he chased were suddenly tangible. Within an hour, he had booked a flight to Rome. He sent a brief, encrypted reply to Elena. Don't speak of this to anyone. I'm on my way. As he packed a small bag, his mind was already racing, turning the puzzle over and over. Who was V? What numbers? And what truth did they tell that was so terrible it had to be disguised as heresy and buried for more than 60 years? Standing in his quiet London office, surrounded by the settled dust of old histories, Julian felt the thrill of the hunt. He wasn't just chasing a story anymore. He was answering a call for help that had been left in a bottle, a plea from a dead man to find a truth he had died to protect. The Vatican had its secrets, but Julian Croft had a reputation. He found things that were meant to stay lost. And he was coming for this one. The air in Rome was thick with heat and history, a familiar combination that always sharpened Julian's senses. He met Elena Rossi not at the Vatican, but in a quiet cafe in the Trastevere district, far from the watchful eyes and listening ears of Borgo Pio. Elena was a woman in her late 50s with intelligent, worried eyes. She slid a folder across the table, her hand trembling slightly. Inside was a high-quality print of the journal page. "I shouldn't have contacted you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clink of espresso cups. "If my superiors find out, they won't," Julian assured her, his voice calm and steady, a practiced bedside manner for those unnerved by proximity to buried secrets. "You did the right thing. History owes you a debt." His reassurance seemed to land, and she nodded, though the fear didn't leave her eyes. For the next hour, he listened as she recounted every detail of the discovery, from the dusty manifest to the feel of the false bottom. He made her describe the chest, its probable origins, its last known movements. Every detail was a potential breadcrumb. When she was finished, he turned his full attention to the page. Holding it was like holding a spark. He could feel the residual energy of Finch's panic. Back in his hotel room, a Spartan space he chose for its anonymity, Julian pinned the page to the wall. For 2 days, he barely left the room, surrounding himself with books on Coptic languages, biblical numerology, and the history of cryptography. He worked on the assumption that Finch, a priest and a linguist, would have used a key rooted in his own world. He tried gematria, the Theban alphabet, substitution ciphers based on the Vulgate Bible. Nothing. The results were gibberish, nonsensical strings of letters. The frustration was a physical weight. He felt like he was failing the man who had written this desperate plea. On the third day, needing to clear his head, he decided to make a formal, preliminary inquiry at the Apostolic Archives, a move that was equal parts strategy and provocation. He wanted to see how the institution would react to the name Finch being spoken aloud after so long. He was granted a brief audience with a junior archivist, a young black-clad Monsignor named Father Lorenzo, whose face was a mask of bland, impenetrable politeness. "Dr. Croft," Lorenzo began, without preamble, "we are aware of your particular interests. The file on Father Alistair Finch is permanently sealed. It is a matter of pastoral care to protect the reputation of a man who suffered a great spiritual tragedy." Julian pushed gently. "I have reason to believe the official narrative may be incomplete. I believe his work was not theological, but historical." Lorenzo's smile was thin, reptilian. "The Church has determined the nature of his work. We consider the matter closed. To pursue it further would be unproductive, and it would be seen as a great disrespect to his memory." The veiled threat was unmistakable. The door was not just closed, it was barred. As Julian walked away through the grand, echoing halls of the Vatican, he wasn't discouraged. He was energized. The institutional resistance was a form of confirmation. They weren't protecting a tragic priest, they were protecting a secret. The stone walling itself was a clue. Back in his room, he stared at the page again, the priest's polite, menacing words echoing in his ears. Unproductive. Disrespect. They were hiding something. He slumped into his chair, the failed decryptions spread out before him. He had been looking at it all wrong. He had been thinking like a theologian. But the note said, "The numbers tell the true story." He had to stop looking at Finch the priest and start looking at Finch the codebreaker. What if the key wasn't sacred at all? What if it was profane? Julian spent another day and night in the suffocating confines of his hotel room, staring at the wall where the page was pinned. The cipher stared back, a silent, mocking testament to his failure. He had exhausted every theological and linguistic key he could imagine. The wall of institutional resistance he'd hit with Father Lorenzo had only hardened his resolve, but it had offered no new avenues of investigation. He was stuck. He felt Finch's frustration as if it were his own, a man with a vital truth to tell, trapped in a language no one could understand. Defeated for the moment, he left the hotel and walked. He wandered aimlessly through the streets of Rome, letting the city's chaotic energy wash over him. He found himself in the Campo da Fiori, the site where the philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for heresy. Julian stood before the brooding, hooded statue of Bruno, a monument to the Church's historical intolerance for inconvenient truths. He thought about Finch. The official story was heresy, but the note said numbers. They see only heresy, but the numbers tell the true story. What if the accusation of heresy was the disguise, the cloak thrown over the real secret? He had been trying to decode the heresy. He needed to decode the numbers. His mind drifted away from theology and towards the other great power of the Vatican: finance. The Vatican Bank, the vast, opaque portfolios of real estate, the centuries of accumulated wealth. It was an institution as much about money as it was about God. He remembered a lecture he'd once attended on the history of Renaissance banking. The great Florentine houses, the Medici, had used complex ciphers in their ledgers to protect their transactions from rivals and popes alike. These ciphers weren't based on literature or philosophy. They were based on the mundane mechanics of their business. Column numbers, interest rates, exchange rates. It was a long shot, a wild leap of intuition. But his logic had failed him. It was time for instinct. He hurried back to the hotel, a new, frantic energy coursing through him. He pulled up digital archives of mid-20th century Vatican financial reports, specifically those concerning the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, or APSA. It was a dry and torturous read, but he was looking for patterns, for repeating numbers, for a system. He found a public report from 1956, a year before Finch's disappearance, detailing asset management protocols. It contained tables of account codes, transfer protocols, and currency conversion charts. It was a dry, bureaucratic document, utterly devoid of spirituality. It was perfect. Using the account code structures as a potential key, he returned to the cipher. He took the first string of numbers on Finch's page and cross-referenced it with an APSA routing number from the 1956 report. Then he applied a simple substitution based on its position in the ledger. He held his breath and began to translate the letters that followed. The first word emerged from the gibberish, clear and stark: Valeriano. Julian's blood ran cold. He kept going, his hands flying across the keyboard. The text wasn't Coptic heresy. It was a ledger, a secret ledger. Valeriano. Transfer. Swiss. 400 M lire. Source obscured. Non ecclesiastical. Origin codex. The rest of the line was a different cipher, likely referring to the ancient text Finch was supposedly translating. It was happening. He was breaking it. The page was not a confession of lost faith. It was an accusation of monumental theft, written in the secret language of money. And it started with a name. V was Valeriano. Julian felt a profound, chilling sense of vindication. Finch hadn't been a heretic. He had been an auditor, an accidental one, who had stumbled upon a crime so vast it could shake the Church to its foundations. A crime that someone named Valeriano had gone to great lengths to conceal. Julian now knew he wasn't just solving a disappearance. He was uncovering a heist at the heart of the Holy See. With the name Valeriano now pulsing at the center of the mystery, Julian's investigation took on a new, dangerous focus. The name itself was not obscure. A quick search through the Vatican's official histories painted a glowing portrait of Cardinal Silvio Valeriano. Born into minor Italian nobility, he had risen through the Curia in the tumultuous years during and after World War II. He was universally praised as a financial genius, a brilliant administrator who had single-handedly stabilized the Vatican's finances in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Official photographs showed a man with shrewd, intelligent eyes, a patrician bearing, and the confident air of someone accustomed to power. He was presented as a savior, a man who had protected the church's assets through shrewd investments and fiscal discipline, earning the deep gratitude of Pope Pius XII. He had died of a heart attack in 1968, hailed in his eulogy as a pillar of the Holy Mother Church. He was the perfect hidden in plain sight culprit, his reputation a fortress of respectability. Julian saw the horrifying brilliance of the cover-up. If Finch had come forward with accusations against such a revered figure, who would have been believed? The obscure linguist or the celebrated financial savior of the Vatican? By framing Finch's discovery as a heretical crisis, Valeriano had not only silenced his accuser, but had also discredited him in the most profound way possible within that world. Finch's sanity and soul were put on trial, not Valeriano's books. The single decoded page was a bombshell, but it wasn't enough. It was one man's cryptic accusation. To expose the truth, Julian needed the rest of Finch's work, the full context of his discovery. He needed the entire journal. He turned his attention back to the page, focusing now on the second part of the cipher, the section that followed the word codex. This part wasn't financial. The symbols were different, more esoteric. He cross-referenced them again with his Coptic texts, and this time he found a match. They were directional markers, but written in a specific, localized dialect he traced to a small monastic order with roots in the Italian Alps. The translated phrase was chillingly poetic. Where the eagle sleeps and the stones speak, my voice waits in the cold hearth. Julian's heart hammered in his chest. It was a clue, a breadcrumb trail left by a man who knew he might not survive. Where the eagle sleeps. He scanned maps, looking for monasteries in the Alps associated with that particular order. He found one, the monastery of San Geronimo al Nido dell'Aquila, St. Jerome at the Eagle's Nest. It was remote, perched high in the Dolomites, a place known for its isolation and its ancient library. A check of Finch's biography confirmed it. He had attended a 2-week silent retreat there in the spring of 1957, just 3 months before he vanished. The cold hearth. It had to be there. The rest of his journal was hidden there. Julian knew he had to go. The trip would be risky. He was now a person of interest to the Vatican's internal security. They had likely flagged his passport, and his movements were probably being monitored. He couldn't fly directly. He took a train to Geneva, then rented a car under a different name, crossing the border into Italy through a small, quiet checkpoint in the mountains. As he drove the winding, treacherous roads up into the Dolomites, the scale of his undertaking settled upon him. He was a lone academic, armed with a dead man's riddle, heading towards a secluded monastery to find a book that would accuse one of the 20th century church's most powerful men of being a master criminal. The air grew thin and cold. The jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at the sky, indifferent and ancient. This was a world away from the political intrigue of Rome. This was a place of isolation, of secrets kept by stone and silence. He was walking into the heart of Finch's last refuge, hoping to find the voice that had been extinguished 60 years ago, the voice that waited for him in the cold hearth. The monastery of San Geronimo al Nido dell'Aquila clung to the mountainside like a promise of sanctuary in a hostile world. It was a severe, imposing structure of gray stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and prayer. Julian felt as if he had stepped back in time. The air was crisp and silent, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind through the pines. A handful of monks still lived there, maintaining the building and its famous library more out of duty than vitality. The place felt like a museum of faith, its true purpose having faded long ago. Julian presented himself as a doctoral student researching medieval manuscript preservation, a plausible cover that granted him access to the library. He was met by the abbot, a frail man named Brother Matteo, whose eyes held a weary, watery wisdom. When Julian casually mentioned he was also interested in the monastery's mid-28th century history, the old monk's expression didn't change, but Julian sensed a flicker of something behind the placid facade. "We had many visitors then," Matteo said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. Men, seeking solace from a broken world. He led Julian into the library. It was a magnificent, vaulted chamber, cold and smelling of old paper and wood smoke. Sunlight struggled through a high, grimy rose window. At the far end of the room was a massive, unlit fireplace, its hearth black with the soot of ages. The cold hearth. Julian's pulse quickened. He spent the day pretending to study manuscripts, his eyes constantly straying to the fireplace. He knew he couldn't just start pulling stones out. He needed a moment alone. That evening, he engaged Brother Matteo in conversation, steering the topic to the retreatants of the 1950s. "I remember few," the old monk said, his gaze distant. "There was an Englishman, a priest. Very quiet, very intense. He spent all his time in here, reading. But he wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at the walls, the stones, as if he were trying to memorize the architecture." "Father Finch?" Julian asked, keeping his voice level. Brother Matteo nodded slowly. That was his name. He seemed troubled, like a man carrying a heavy, invisible weight. He left just before the first snow. We never heard from him again. The old monk's words were the final confirmation Julian needed. He waited until after the evening meal, when the monks retired for their nightly prayers. The library would be locked, but he had noticed that one of the tall windows at the back of the chapel had a broken latch. Under the cover of a moonless night, Julian slipped out of his guest cell, crossed the frozen courtyard, and made his way to the chapel. He worked the window open and slipped inside, the cold of the stone floor seeping through his shoes. He moved like a ghost through the silent monastery, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness, until he was back in the library. The great fireplace loomed before him like a dark mouth, where the stones speak. He ran his hands over the cold, rough-hewn stones around the hearth, feeling for anything loose, any subtle sign of disturbance. He started at the bottom, tapping gently, listening. It was just above the mantel, on the left side, that he found it. A single stone, no bigger than a book, that shifted a fraction of an inch under his pressure. It was almost imperceptible. Using the blade of a pocket knife, he carefully worked it out of its socket. Behind it was a dark, hollow space. And inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a small, leather-bound journal. His breath plumed in the frigid air. He had found it. He sat on the floor in the darkness, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the cover. He opened it to the first page. It was Finch's hand, clear and precise. The date at the top was from the first day of his fateful translation project. Julian began to read, and the full horrifying story of Father Alistair Finch's last months finally began to unfold. The voice from the cold hearth was ready to speak. The silence of the ancient library was absolute as Julian sat on the stone floor, the single beam of his flashlight a sacred space in the immense darkness. He read, and the world outside, the cold, the risk, the sleeping monks, fell away. The journal was not a chaotic rant. It was the meticulous, devastating record of a brilliant mind realizing it had been weaponized. Finch began with excitement. He described the Coptic texts, believing he was on the cusp of a major theological discovery. The codices were unique, detailing the financial and logistical structures of early Christian communities in Egypt, particularly how they secretly moved and managed assets to survive Roman persecution. It was a historical, not a heretical, puzzle. But then, about a month into his work, Cardinal Valeriano began to take a personal interest. The cardinal, a man Finch initially admired, would visit him late at night, asking pointed, specific questions not about the theology, but about the mechanics of the transactions. He wanted to know how assets were hidden, how they were passed through generations without a paper trail, how they were liquidated using verbal codes and trusted agents. The journal entries grew more troubled. Finch detailed his slow-dawning horror as he realized Valeriano was not interested in history. The cardinal was using Finch's translations as a Rosetta Stone, a key to unlock a vast, parallel financial empire hidden within the church itself. For centuries, wealthy patrons had bequeathed fortunes, land, and art to the church through obscure trusts and ancient, semi-defunct monastic orders. These assets had lain dormant, forgotten, lost in a bureaucratic and canonical jungle. The Coptic text provided Valeriano with the methodology to identify, access, and secretly liquidate them. The journal became a ledger of dread. Finch began tracking Valeriano's movements, cross-referencing them with fragments of financial news. V. travels to Zurich. A week later, the Diocese of Milan sells a 15th-century villa for a fraction of its value to a secular holding company. The company's charter is based in Panama. The money is gone. He was documenting a grand heist, a systematic plundering of the church's deep assets, rerouted into Valeriano's personal slush fund, a fund he used to buy influence, consolidate power, and live a life of secret luxury. The accusation of heresy had been Valeriano's masterstroke. The Cardinal had taken a few of Finch's more speculative notes about early Gnostic influences and presented them to a powerful, ultra-conservative faction within the Curia, portraying Finch as a dangerous modernist on the verge of a faith-shattering discovery. It was a smokescreen, and it worked perfectly. Finch was isolated, his project now shrouded in suspicion. The final entries were terrifying. Finch wrote that he had gathered enough proof to expose the Cardinal. He had compiled a dossier. He described his decision to confront Valeriano directly, appealing to his conscience, a last, desperate act of faith in the system he had served his entire life. "I will meet him tonight in his private apartments," Finch wrote. "I will present him with what I know. He is a prince of the church. He cannot be a common thief. God must surely still have a hold on his heart. I pray I am not wrong." The very last entry was scrawled on a new page, dated the following day. The handwriting was nearly illegible, a frantic spasm of ink. He laughed. He called me a fool. "It is not theft," he said, "it is control. It is power. He has invited me to a final meeting, a drive to the countryside, to discuss my future. I know what this means. I am leaving this book in the eagle's nest. If I do not return, the numbers tell the true story. Forgive me for my naivety." And then, the journal simply ended. Julian closed the book, his hands shaking. He had just read the final will and testament of a murdered man. Finch hadn't fled. He had been taken on a one-way drive to the countryside, a discussion from which he never returned. Julian sat in the darkness for a long time, the weight of the journal in his lap a physical burden. He was no longer just a historian. He was a witness. He now held the confession, the evidence, and the motive. His next and final move was clear. He had to take this truth back to the place it was born, back to the Vatican. He had to confront the institution that had allowed this to happen and had spent 60 years ensuring the silence was never broken. Armed with the devastating truth of Finch's journal, Julian returned to Rome. The city's chaotic energy now felt menacing. Its ancient stones witnesses to countless unspoken crimes. He knew he couldn't simply leak the journal. Without context, without an institutional response, it could be dismissed as a forgery, a historical fantasy concocted by a known Vatican critic. He needed to force a reaction. He needed to present the evidence to the modern incarnation of the power that had silenced Finch. He needed to confront the gatekeeper of the secrets. Through a series of persistent, unignorable requests, citing a discovery of paramount historical importance to the pontificate of Pius XII, he secured a meeting with the current prefect of the Apostolic Archives, Monsignor Declan Gallo. Gallo was the direct successor to the men who had overseen the archives in Valeriano's day. He was a respected, formidable figure, an insider's insider, known for his sharp intellect and unwavering loyalty to the Holy See. The meeting took place in Gallo's private office, a magnificent room lined with priceless, leather-bound tomes. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and power. Gallo, a man in his late 60s with piercing blue eyes and a calm, commanding presence, gestured for Julian to sit. He was the very picture of refined, institutional authority. "Dr. Croft," Gallo began, his voice smooth as polished marble, "your persistence is remarkable. You claimed a matter of paramount importance. I am listening." Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed a bound copy of his full translation of Finch's journal on the polished desk between them. "I have found the lost work of Father Alistair Finch," he said, his voice steady. "And it is not a work of heresy. It is a detailed exposé of Cardinal Silvio Valeriano's systematic embezzlement of church assets, and it contains Father Finch's final testimony before he was murdered on the Cardinal's orders in 1957. Monsignor Gallo did not flinch. He did not look surprised. He simply steepled his fingers and stared at Julian, his blue eyes unreadable. He listened intently as Julian laid out the entire story, the coded page, the financial ciphers, the hunt for the journal, the final damning entries. When Julian finished, the silence in the room was profound. Gallo finally leaned forward, his expression not a shock, but of immense, sorrowful gravity. "You are a brilliant researcher, Dr. Croft," he said softly. "More brilliant than you know. What you have uncovered is, in its essence, the truth." Julian was stunned into silence. He had expected denial, threats, an immediate security response. He had not expected a confession. "The institution knows," Julian whispered, the realization dawning on him. Gallo gave a slow, sad nod. A very small circle knew. After Valeriano's death, his private papers were reviewed. The scale of his operations became clear, as did the high probability of his involvement in Father Finch's disappearance. "A quiet, internal investigation confirmed most of what you have discovered." "Then why?" Julian demanded, his voice rising. "Why the cover-up? Why let the world believe Finch was a failed priest? Why protect a monster?" This was the moment of confrontation, not with a single man, but with the chilling logic of the institution he represented. "Consider the time, Doctor," Gallo said, his voice taking on a pedagogical tone. "The late 1950s, the height of the Cold War. The Church was a bulwark against atheistic communism. Its moral authority was a geopolitical weapon. What would have happened if it were revealed that one of its most senior cardinals was a thief and a murderer? That the Vatican's finances were a house of cards built on a foundation of plunder? It would have caused a schism, a collapse of faith on a global scale. It would have handed a victory to Moscow. So a choice was made, a terrible choice. A man's life, his reputation, for the greater good?" Julian asked, the words tasting like ash. "Father Finch was a casualty in a war, Doctor," Gallo said, his gaze unwavering. "A tragic, deeply regrettable casualty. His sacrifice, as it was seen, protected the Church from an existential threat. The truth was sealed, entrusted to God and to history, to be managed by men like me. We are not proud of it. We are keepers of the scars, not the authors of the wounds." He pushed the translated journal back across the desk. "I am asking you, Dr. Croft, to become a keeper of that scar. Let this story remain in the past. To release it now would serve no purpose, but to open old wounds and damage the faith of millions over the sins of a man long dead." The choice was laid bare. Julian was being invited into the conspiracy of silence, offered a place as a custodian of the terrible choice. The final confrontation wasn't about proving the truth, but about what to do with it. Julian Croft walked out of Monsignor Gallo's office and into the vastness of St. Peter's Square. The sun was setting, bathing the great basilica in a light that felt both glorious and deceptive. Gallo's words echoed in his mind, a cold and pragmatic defense of an unforgivable sin. A casualty in a war. Keepers of the scars. It was the timeless argument of power, that some truths are too dangerous to be told, that the stability of the institution outweighs the lives of individuals. He held the fate of Alistair Finch's memory in his hands. He could heed Gallo's plea, consigning the journal back to the darkness, becoming another link in the chain of silence. He would be respected in some circles, a man who understood the complexities of power. Finch would remain a tragic footnote, his name a lie. Or he could do what he, as a historian, was meant to do. He could honor the evidence. He could speak for the dead. He sat on the edge of a fountain, the water splashing, indifferent to his moral crisis. He thought of Finch, the brilliant, devout man, whose faith was not in the institution, but in the truth. He thought of his last, naive prayer that the cardinal must still have a hold on God's heart. Finch hadn't died protecting the church. He had died trying to save it from itself. His murder wasn't a sacrifice for the greater good. It was the ultimate act of corruption, silencing truth to protect power. The greater good that Gallo spoke of was not the good of the faithful, but the good of the powerful. In that moment, Julian's choice became clear. It was never really a choice at all. That night, from a secure laptop in his anonymous hotel room, he did not write an academic paper. He compiled everything. The scanned pages of the original journal, his full, annotated translation, a detailed narrative of his investigation, and a transcript of his conversation with Gallo, written from memory. He wrote a cover letter, not to a historical society, but to the International Investigative Desk of one of the world's most respected news agencies. He attached the files, took a deep breath, and clicked send. The resolution was not a dramatic confrontation in a courtroom. It came a week later, quietly at first, then as a tidal wave. An alert flashed across a television screen in a London pub, where Julian was nursing a drink. Breaking news: leaked Vatican documents from 1950s allege vast financial scandal, implicate cardinal in murder of priest. The story was everywhere. The Vatican's press office issued a terse, non-denial denial, promising a full internal review. Historians and journalists besieged the archives. The name Alistair Finch was spoken on every news channel, no longer as a tragic heretic, but as a whistleblower and a martyr for truth. Monsignor Gallo was quietly reassigned. The fortress of silence, so carefully maintained for over 60 years, had been breached not by an army, but by the quiet persistence of one man and the indelible power of a story that refused to stay buried. Julian watched the news unfold, a somber sense of closure washing over him. He had not exposed the secret to destroy faith, but to affirm it, a faith that the truth, no matter how dark or long buried, is always worth fighting for. In clearing Father Finch's name, he had provided a final, hopeful resolution. He had ensured that the voice from the cold hearth was finally heard, a testament to the idea that no institution, no matter how powerful, can ever truly own history.